So many depictions. There's so many beautiful things going on. Well, I love the first readings of Easter, because they're the disciples out doing Jesus things. Did you notice that as Peter was walking through the streets, just that his shadow would fall on people and they were healed, a sign of the Messianic age through the church. Pretty amazing. So when I think of our poor brother Peter, who was denying Christ 3 times, and here he is, what a transition. One of the other striking transitions in the scriptures is the way that Jesus greets his disciples. Did you pick up on it? During his public ministry, in the call of the first disciples, in the raising of Jairus' daughter, just about any time, the first words out of Jesus' mouth when confronted with something are, "Do not be afraid," or some variation thereof. I love it when he's walking on the sea. They think they're seeing a ghost. "Get a hold of yourselves. Do not be afraid. It is I," Really? And then Peter says, "Well, let me come out to the water." "Okay, Pete, come on out. The water's fine," Do not be afraid. It seems to be the greeting. When the angel greets Mary, what's the first words out of his mouth? "Do not be afraid. You have found favor with God." So on and forth. All through the public ministry up to this point, it's "do not be afraid." What are the first words out of his mouth tonight? "Peace be with you." What's going on here? How do we move from fear to peace, not only in the scriptures, but how about in our own lives? So let's look at fear. Let's look at fear first, so we can understand what we're talking about before we move on to peace. First, let's talk about reasonable fear. Now, reasonable fear in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's actually, as we all know here, reasonable fear is very useful for survival, isn't it? When we find ourselves between the sow bear and her cubs, it's a good thing to be afraid and to remove oneself from the area. Or when the hackles go up and the ears go back on the bull moose in the front yard, fear is a good thing. Get to safety. But this is very different from unreasonable fear, such as fear of failure, fear of embarrassment, fear of appearing too religious. Such fear paralyzes us, keeps us from doing the loving thing, as I've said earlier. As such, it can be rightly said that the opposite of love is not hate. It's fear. That fear that keeps us from loving. But peace drives out fear, especially the peace that Christ gives. When we use this peace, or shalom as it is used in both Aramaic and in Hebrew, the one that Christ is talking about is the reality of when things are as they are intended to be. If everything is rightly ordered, as Thomas Aquinas says, then there is peace. When things are as God intends them to be, there is peace. Before the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ, remember, things were not as they were intended. We had messed it up. Things were out of whack. We had messed up our relationship with God. Sin had entered the world and had held it in its grip. And fear was the result. However, after Christ reconciled all creation to the Father in his one perfect sacrifice on the cross, the world was set aright. In fact, it was better. Think of the relationship between humanity and God before the fall, which was what we call original bliss. And now, think of the relationship with humanity and God after the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ, as we enter into a holy communion. It's deeper, more intimate than we could ever imagine. Certainly than they could ever imagine. I run into this a lot with married couples that are experiencing some pain in their marriage and some trouble and a rough time in their marriage. Every marriage goes through 5 stages. There's marital bliss, interestingly enough, called. If you're lucky, this lasts for hours. I love being married to you. Second is the disillusionment, the stripping away of illusions. And just the nature of the relationship will do that. Third has been called many things, but it's typified it's a time of fear, really, because where one or both are physically, mentally, or spiritually exhausted, and they don't feel anything. And you hear this a lot, I don't feel like I love you. Well, we know love is not a feeling. It comes with a lot of neat feelings. But they have emptied themselves, and their own resources aren't enough. And there's fear. But then there's reconciliation, which is the rebuilding of a relationship in a way you cannot imagine beforehand. And then that fifth stage, deeper covenantal love. It's the same thing. Why is marriage used as a sign of God's faithfulness, as a sign of the Paschal mystery? Because that's exactly what's going on with humanity and God. There was original bliss. There was a stripping away. There was that things where things reached ahead. Then there was reconciliation and deeper relationship than ever thought possible. So when he reconciled all things to the Father, the world was set aright, and our relationship with God became deeper and more intimate than we could have ever imagined. The effects of sin, of course, are still around, but sin no longer has mastery over the world or anyone in it. Christ has broken the bonds of sin, of suffering, and of death. The possibilities are literally eternal. They are endless. Sin, suffering, and death are still part of the human reality, but they can't rule our lives. They can't take central place. Like Christ, we transcend the vagaries of the present age and rise above to a new life in the Spirit. This is the peace the world cannot give. This is the peace of Christ.